There is a particular kind of quiet that comes from a show you have already seen 100 times. You do not need to watch it. You know the shape of every scene before it arrives. The yellow light of the living room, the couch, the small brass fanfare that plays before the family lands in front of the television. Homer's voice, Marge's low, patient hum, the way Bart says something and you already know how Lisa will answer. In that half-awake state, when your eyes have closed but the room is still murmuring, the familiarity does the work that sleep needs. Nothing can surprise you. Nothing asks anything of you. The town of Springfield keeps running its small machinery in the dark, and you are allowed to let go of it. And yet, underneath that comfort, this show hides something stranger than most people notice. For more than 30 years, it has told and retold the story of who these characters are. And again it has changed the answers, contradicted itself, quietly rewritten the past, and then rewritten the rewrite. Tonight is about those contradictions. It is about the dark theory the show keeps almost telling about every character in it. The sense that no one in Springfield has a fixed history at all. Think about what that means for a place you have loved falling asleep to for years. Welcome to Donuto. This is a channel for the long, dark hours, for the nights when your mind will not settle and you need a voice to walk beside it, slowly, going nowhere in particular. There is nothing here you need to keep up with. You can drift off in the first few minutes and lose nothing, and if you wake somewhere in the middle, you will find the same calm still waiting for you. So find whatever position lets your shoulders drop. Turn the lights down or leave them off entirely. Let the pillow take the weight of your head and let the town settle into the quiet with you. And we will begin. There is a peculiar bargain at the center of The Simpsons, one the series made so discreetly that most viewers never notice they agreed to it. The characters do not age. Bart stays 10, Lisa stays 8, Maggie stays an infant, and Homer and Marge remain fixed at the ages they were when it began, decade after decade after decade, and yet the world around them moves. Episodes are generally set in the year they were produced, which means the town of Springfield is always contemporary, always keeping pace with whatever is happening outside the television, while the family inside it refuses to grow up. Writers call this a floating timeline. It is a device of convenience, a way to keep a sitcom running indefinitely without the awkwardness of watching children become adults. But it has a strange side effect, and that side effect is where our story begins. Because if the present is always now, then the past has to keep moving too. Consider what that does to a flashback. When the program wants to tell you how Homer and Marge met, it cannot simply pick a year and leave it there, because the family is perpetually the same age, so the courtship slides. Early flashback episodes placed their young love in the 1970s, all the fashions and the music of that era. And for a long time that was simply the history of these people, accepted and settled. Then, years later, the show reached back again, and the past had drifted forward with the present. The 1970s had become inconvenient, and so the memory was rewritten without comment. The episode that did this most openly is called That 90s Show, a season 19 entry that took Homer and Marge's courtship and moved it wholesale into the 1990s. In this version, there is a breakup. There is Homer, briefly, forming a grunge band. There are all the trappings of a decade that had nothing to do with the story it had told before. And here is the thing worth sitting with. This did not merely add detail to an existing history. It contradicted it directly. 2 flashbacks, 2 decades, 2 incompatible accounts of the same 2 lives. The show did not blink. When people noticed, and people did notice, it was the show's own runner who ended up defending the change publicly, shrugging off the uproar as just another case of the writers having fun with whatever era the show happened to be airing in. His argument, in effect, was that the floating timeline made it permissible, that the whole machinery of the program had always silently assumed the past would drift, and this was simply that machinery working as designed. It is an honest defense, in its way. It admits that the history is not fixed, that it was never fixed, that memory in Springfield is a thing that bends to the needs of the present. And then something telling happened. The episodes that followed largely ignored the 1990s backstory. They drifted back to the 70s and the 80s, to the older version of the courtship, as though the grunge band had never happened. So the show contradicted its own history, defended the contradiction, and then calmly abandoned the contradiction and returned to what it had contradicted. If you are looking for solid ground here, there is none. That is the point. And the courtship is only the gentlest example. There is a far stranger one, and it involves a man most viewers assumed they understood completely. Principal Seymour Skinner, the rigid, weary head of Springfield Elementary, a character built across seasons of flashbacks that established his childhood, his mother, his life. In an episode from season 9, called The Principal and the Pauper, the episode reveals that this man is not Seymour Skinner at all. He is an impostor named Armin Tamzarian who, the episode tells us, took the identity of his commanding officer in Vietnam and simply became him, wearing the dead man's name and life like a borrowed coat. Every flashback that had ever shown you Skinner's past was, in an instant, declared false. The history you thought you knew was reassigned to a stranger. This is a much colder act than the courtship rewrite, and the people who made the series felt it. Matt Groening, who created the series, has called The Principal and the Pauper one of his least favorite episodes and described it plainly as a mistake. Harry Shearer, who gives Skinner his voice, called the storyline arbitrary and gratuitous, which is a rare thing, an actor publicly rejecting the material his own character was given. And the series itself seemed to agree, because it did something remarkable. It reversed the episode. Not with an on-screen explanation, not with a dramatic undoing, but by simply behaving, in later years, as though it had never happened. Season 21's Boy Meets Curl and Season 26's Walking Big and Tall both simply reaffirm that Agnes Skinner was pregnant with Seymour, that she raised her own son, that this is her boy and always was. The impostor was written out by being ignored. Skinner became Skinner again because everyone decided to pretend. So already we have two histories the show wrote down, defended, and then walked away from. And now consider a third kind of episode, one that does not contradict the past so much as pull the floor out from under the entire show. In the season 11 finale, called Behind the Laughter, The Simpsons becomes a mockumentary, a parody of the VH1 series Behind the Music, and it reframes the whole family as actors. Not as cartoon characters living cartoon lives, but as performers on a fictional sitcom with a fabricated production history, rivalries and comebacks and scandals, the fourth wall not so much broken as demolished. The production has always treated this episode as explicitly non-canon, a joke that stands outside the story. But once you have seen it, a question lingers. If the program can tell you these people are actors, if it can reach outside itself and dissolve its own reality for laughs, then what exactly are you watching in every other episode? What is real here, and by whose authority? The people who make it have given an answer, and it is more radical than you might expect. The executive producer Matt Selman stated, on social media, that there is no such thing as Simpsons canon or non-canon. There are, he said, only stories. Every episode, in his framing, is its own reset, something that only makes sense for that one story, if it makes sense at all. And he added a line that is worth holding on to as we go forward. If all of the events the series has depicted had really happened to a single family, he said, those characters would be in a mental hospital. He is joking, of course, but he is also telling you, from the highest level of the production, that continuity is a fiction the audience imposes, not a promise the show ever made. Selman said this at a particular moment, and the moment matters. The season 36 finale had shown a flash forward, a glimpse of the future in which Homer is seen kneeling at a grave, the scene implying the death of Marge Simpson. The reaction was immediate and enormous. Fans and news outlets responding as though a real death had been confirmed, as though the future of these people were a fixed and knowable thing, and Selman stepped in to clarify. That future was speculative. It was not meant literally. It was one possible story, no more binding than any other. The grave was not a fact. It was a maybe. Hold all of this loosely as we continue, because it is the frame for everything that follows. A show that will not let its people age, that rewrites their pasts and defends the rewrites and then abandons them, that can declare its own characters imposters or actors or grieving widowers, and then take it all back. This is the ground the darker readings grow in. When the history itself refuses to stay still, every viewer becomes, in a sense, their own unreliable narrator, free to choose which version of these lives to believe. There is a moment in the 9th episode of the 12th season that quietly rearranges everything you thought you understood about Homer Simpson, and it does so without ever raising its voice. To sit with it is to consider a question the series had been asking for over a decade without ever quite phrasing it aloud. Is this man stupid, or is this man injured? The distinction sounds small. It is not small. Stupidity is a fixed property of a person, a ceiling they were born beneath. Injury is a thing that happened to someone, a door that closed, and a door that closed can, in principle, be opened again. This episode opens the door. It begins, as the series so often does, with the family in front of a television, watching something absurd. On the screen is a parody of Japanese animation, all bright motion and strange logic, with characters bearing names like Meganot and Princess Tempura, and it is Bart who pauses to tell a puzzled Lisa that cartoons do not have to make sense, a rule the two of them never quite agree on. Consider what the program is doing here before the real story even starts. It is priming you to think about cartoon logic, about the way animated worlds bend causality to their own convenience, about the way a character can survive anything because the medium requires it. The family laughs at the nonsense on the screen. They do not yet know that the nonsense is about to describe their own lives. The engine of the plot arrives through a television studio, where a new process is being demonstrated, a form of motion capture that translates a real body's movements into animation. Homer volunteers as the test subject. What follows is pure physical comedy, the kind Homer was seemingly built to provide. He performs a pose from the children's song about being a little teapot. He throws himself into a comedic full-body flop, collapsing across the floor, and the people running the demonstration remark that his flailing would make a wonderful cartoon possum. Watch him in this scene and you see the Homer everyone knows, the body without a governor, the man whose gift is that he will do anything and feel no embarrassment. It reads as talent. It is worth holding that thought, because the episode is about to reframe that very quality as something closer to symptom. Homer, convinced he has glimpsed the future, decides to invest. He goes to the bank and withdraws the family's entire life savings, and because it is a joint account, the withdrawal requires Marge's signature, a small procedural detail that the episode does not linger on but that carries a quiet weight. Marge signs. The savings leave the account. Homer puts all of it into 500 shares of a single company, Animotion Incorporated, the firm behind the motion capture process. He does not diversify. He does not hedge. He commits everything the family owns to one idea, and the totality of that commitment is itself the tell, the absence of any internal voice asking whether this is wise. The market answers quickly. A news report announces that Animotion stock has plunged 75 points and that the company has declared what it calls super-duper bankruptcy. Because Homer was described as the firm's only stockholder, there is no cushion, no crowd to share the loss with. The wipeout is total, and it belongs to him alone. And here the episode does something that tells you it understands exactly what it is portraying. Homer calls a family meeting to deliver the news that he has lost the family's life savings in the stock market. Then he adds, with a strange note of pride, that he held back just enough money to buy a cowbell. Think about the shape of that mind for a moment. It has just registered a catastrophe and, in the same breath, produced a cheerful non sequitur, a small, pointless purchase treated as a consolation. That is not the reasoning of a lazy man or a careless one. It is reasoning that skips a step everyone else's mind takes automatically. And then the show delivers its most telling stroke, though it is disguised as a throwaway. The instant Homer finishes announcing the loss of everything, the family meeting simply moves on, and Lisa and Marge fall into an argument about Lisa hogging the maple syrup. The financial ruin evaporates as a topic. The syrup takes its place. On first watch, this plays as a joke about how nobody in this house can hold a serious thought. But set it in the context of what the episode is really about, and it becomes something sadder and more precise. In the Simpson household, a disaster of this magnitude does not command the attention it should, because the household has been calibrated over years to a man who cannot hold such thoughts either. The syrup argument is not just a gag, it is the family unconsciously matching the wavelength of its head. The reason for all of it, the hidden variable underneath more than 10 years of behavior, is disclosed as a piece of childhood history. When Homer was 6 years old, he shoved an entire 16-pack of crayons up his nose, and then he sneezed, and out came 15 of them. He counted, in whatever way a 6-year-old counts, and concluded he had gotten them all. He had not. One crayon remained, and it traveled, and it lodged in his brain, and it stayed there through his adolescence, his courtship, his marriage, his fatherhood, his working life. Every choice you have ever watched him make, he made with a foreign object pressed against the machinery of his thinking. It is asking you to run the tape backward through everything you know and reconsider it under this new fact. The mechanism by which he learns the truth is grimly fitting. Having lost the savings, Homer needs money, so he takes a paid medical testing job, the kind where a person rents out their body to science for cash. In the course of the scans, the doctors x-ray his head and find it. The crayon. There it is, an object that has been in him since childhood, visible at last only because poverty drove him to sell access to his own skull. The series is carefully noting that the truth about Homer surfaces not through care or curiosity, but through desperation. That no one went looking for what was wrong with him until he was broke enough to lie down under a machine for money. They remove it. And when they do, Homer's measured intelligence rises by 50 points, from a score of 55 to a score of 105. Watch that number. 55 is not the number of a merely below-average man. It is a number that describes genuine impairment. 105 is ordinary, unremarkable, the middle of the human road. The crayon was the entire difference between disability and normalcy. This is the episode's central and almost unbearable claim, delivered as comedy. Homer was never stupid in the way we mean when we call someone stupid. He was carrying an injury nobody diagnosed, and the moment it was addressed, he became an average man. The idiocy was never who he was. It was what had happened to him. What the newly intelligent Homer does with his restored mind is the part that lingers longest. He bonds with Lisa, finally able to meet his daughter on the ground where she actually lives, and for a while this is tender and right, a father and child connecting across a gap that had always seemed permanent. He gives a speech at a school. He writes a safety report about the nuclear plant, and the report is competent, and its competence is precisely the problem, because it results in the plant being shut down and his co-workers being laid off. His intelligence, aimed at the world, produces consequences the world does not thank him for. His old friends turn from him. The patrons at Moe's Tavern burn him in effigy and bar him from the place. The man became capable, and being capable made him unwelcome among the people who had loved the incapable version. That is the cruelty the episode will not soften. It would be a warmer story if intelligence had simply made Homer happier, if the removal of the crayon had been an unambiguous rescue. It is not. The smart Homer is lonelier than the injured one ever was. He can see more clearly, and much of what he now sees is that the life waiting for him was built for a man who could not see it clearly, and that clarity has no place at the table. So he makes a choice, and the choice is the darkest joke in the whole half hour. He goes to Moe, who describes himself as an unlicensed surgeon, and he has a crayon put back into his brain. Moe calls the procedure the old Crayola oblongata, a pun folding a wax crayon into the name of a part of the brainstem, and performs it in the back of a bar with no license and no oversight. Take the full weight of that. Homer chose the injury. Offered a life of ordinary intelligence and the isolation that came with it, he elected instead to return to the impairment, because the impairment was where his family and his friends and his happiness were kept. The crayon was not merely a defect the story removed and studied. It was, in the end, the price of belonging, a thing he reached back into himself and reinstalled on purpose. And so the question the episode opened with closes on an answer no one asked for. Homer is not stupid. He is a man who was hurt as a child, who was briefly made whole, and who looked at wholeness and calmly decided he would rather be hurt again among his own. There is a single episode where the seams show. One episode where the man who blesses his neighbors and calls his own children by soft, invented endearments finally comes apart, and it happens in the aftermath of a hurricane that levels his home. Watch what the storm leaves standing. When Ned Flanders walks through the wreckage of everything he owns, he reports, without irony, that the only things to survive are the family tombstones, and he says of them that they are all we have left. Think about what that sentence contains. A man surveys the ruin of his living world and finds comfort in the markers of the dead, and he offers this not as despair, but as an accounting, calm, almost grateful, the way he offers everything. The gratitude is the tell. Em meio aos destroços, dos filhos aparece preso dentro de uma árvore caída e diz simplesmente que tem dor de cabeça. E enquanto o liberta, Ned responde que estão todos vivos, e que isso já é motivo de gratidão. It is a reasonable thing to say. It is also a reflex, and the reflex never switches off. He does not curse the sky. He does not ask why. He reaches, as he always reaches, for the ledger of blessings, and he tallies survival as a credit, even while standing in the debit of total loss. There is a discipline in that, and the episode, quietly, is about where that discipline came from and what it costs to maintain. Consider the practical shape of his ruin. His house is not covered, and the reason is pure Flanders. He does not believe in insurance because he considers it a form of gambling, and gambling is a vice, and so he has declined the ordinary hedge that ordinary people place against catastrophe. He has, in effect, refused to bet against God, and God, or the weather, has called that bet. The rigidity that makes him decent, the same rigidity that will not let him take a wager even to protect his children, is the rigidity that leaves him homeless. You begin to see that his goodness is not soft. It is load-bearing, and it is brittle, and a strong enough wind finds the fault line. The town around him behaves the way towns behave. His store, the leftorium, the little shop of goods for left-handed people, is set upon by a storm-crazed mob, and the report of the scene carries a detail so absurd it doubles as a verdict on the whole community. People are grabbing things with both hands. In a store built entirely for the left-handed, the looters loot two-fisted, taking what they cannot use, ransacking a man whose entire commercial premise is gentleness toward the overlooked. Ned's charity to the world is answered by the world's greed, and even the greed is incompetent, and he absorbs this too. Even his children absorb it, in their own broken register. Having lost everything, the boys are dressed from a donation bin, and what comes out of that bin is a small, sad comedy. One boy announces that he is a surfer. Vestindo uma camisola que aponta o dedo e diz que está do lado do burro, dos filhos solta uma frase que cai como uma pedra num lago parado, dizendo que o Todd é burro e que ele está do lado dele, e depois volta-se para a Malde e acrescenta que agora a mãe também é burra. It is played for a joke, and it is a joke, but underneath it is the family's whole method of coping laid bare. When the worst arrives, the Flanders response is to keep smiling, to keep the patter going, to convert the unbearable into a bit. They have all learned it. The question the episode finally asks is where the father learned it first. The answer comes when Ned breaks. His house is rebuilt, badly, by Homer and a crew of well-meaning incompetents, and when the new house collapses, something in Ned collapses with it, giving us one of the rare times the show lets his anger fully break through. He turns on the gathered townspeople one by one and berates them, individually, precisely, with a clarity he has spent his whole adult life suppressing. He calls Moe an ugly, hate-filled man. He tells Homer, flatly, that he is the worst human being Ned has ever met. And here is the strange thing about the moment. It is not deranged, it is accurate. The rage, when it finally arrives, is not madness. It is honesty, long overdue, and it has simply lost the vocabulary for anything gentler. That loss of vocabulary is not a metaphor in this episode. It has a documented cause. Ned is taken to see a psychiatrist from his own childhood, Dr. Foster, and the session becomes an excavation. Homer, of all people, is brought in to provoke him, to needle him into anger, and for a long time it fails, because Ned's suppression is total. Then, at last, the admission surfaces. He allows that he does not like the service at the post office, and then, pushing further than he has ever pushed, that you might even say he hates the post office. And then the real confession, the one underneath, that and my parents. Lousy beatniks. 2 flat words carrying a lifetime of withheld resentment. The flashback that follows explains the machinery of the man. Young Ned is destructive, uncontrolled, and his beatnik parents refuse, on principle, to correct him. The father tells the same Dr. Foster that they cannot do it, that discipline itself is the thing they will not impose, and the mother offers the exhausted confession that they have tried nothing and are all out of ideas. Consider the perversity of that. A philosophy of total permissiveness produces a child no one will govern, and the child, ungoverned, is miserable, because a child needs a shape to grow against and has been given none. The parents mistake their neglect for freedom. The freedom is a kind of abandonment. And then the correction, when it comes, is as extreme as the neglected answers. Dr. Foster prescribes what he calls the University of Minnesota Spankological Protocol, which is exactly what its ugly name suggests. Straight spanking for 8 months in a row, an unbroken season of physical punishment. It works. That is the horror of it. It works too well. It does not teach young Ned to manage his anger. It teaches him that anger cannot be expressed at all. And so the anger goes somewhere, and where it goes is into that nonsensical jabbering, the diddly and the doodly, the private language that so many people take for mere quirk. The theory the fans build on this is not much of a leap, because the episode has already built it. The cheer is not the absence of rage. The cheer is the lid. Notice, finally, what Dr. Foster counts as a cure. He does not release Ned when Ned has learned to feel his anger safely, or to speak it, or to hold it. He releases him the instant Ned admits, live, with Foster watching through the two-way mirror, that he hates his parents. The bare admission of hatred is treated as the whole of the therapy, the successful outcome, the finish line. Foster declares him cured on the strength of a single sentence and lets him walk out of the asylum. But an admission is not a resolution. Saying the word hate once into a recorder does not drain the reservoir. It only proves the reservoir is there. Ned leaves that room with the rage intact, named but not disarmed, and he goes on to live decades of chipper suppression on top of it, until a hurricane and a collapsing house pull the lid off in front of the whole town. So when people say that Flanders is a trauma response barely containing violent rage, they are, in this one episode, simply describing what is on the screen. A child neglected into chaos, then beaten into silence. An adult who converts fury into gibberish and loss into gratitude and catastrophe into a tally of blessings, because the alternative, the thing underneath, is the man who tells Homer to his face that he is the worst human being he has ever met. That man is real. He lives down there the whole time. The smile is what he built over the door. In A Milhouse Divided, the 8th season, the collapse arrives at a dinner party. Marge hosts it, and for a while it is only awkward the way adult evenings can be awkward, until a game of Pictionary turns the temperature up past what the room can hold. Kirk and Luann Van Houten begin as a married couple performing normalcy for their friends, and they end the night as two people who cannot pretend anymore. The game grows volatile, and when it breaks, Luann demands a divorce, plainly in front of everyone, with no ceremony and no softening. Watch how the show stages the end of a marriage, not in a courtroom or a screaming hallway, but over a party board game, because that is where these things actually detonate, in the middle of an ordinary evening that was supposed to be pleasant. What follows for Kirk is a kind of methodical stripping away. Luann is awarded custody of Milhouse, and Kirk moves out, alone, into an apartment complex that the series frames as the standard destination of the newly divorced father. Then the job goes too. He is fired from the cracker factory as well, and fans have long noted how cruelly circular the timing feels, arriving right on top of the divorce that just upended his home. Look at how that lands on Kirk. The same event that ends his marriage also ends his livelihood, and the man delivering the second blow is the father of the woman delivering the first. In the span of one episode, he loses his wife, his son's daily presence, his home, and his work, and the losses are all fingers of the same hand. But this chapter is not really about Kirk. It is about the boy left in the wreckage, and the program is careful to show us how that boy learns of the divorce. There is a school bus scene, and it is here that Milhouse absorbs the news from the least comforting messengers imaginable. It's Kearney who tells him, in effect, that these things pass, offering the line, "My divorce was tough on my kid, but he got over it." And then Kearney's son adds, "I sleep in a drawer." Consider the bleak comedy of that exchange. The children of Springfield have so much practice with broken homes that they can counsel each other on the bus, casually, the way other children might trade lunch items. Milhouse is being welcomed into a club he never asked to join, and the welcome is the small consolation that he is not the only one, alongside the harder truth that some of the others sleep in drawers. This is the ground Milhouse stands on, and it helps explain why the rest of his story bends the way it does. A child whose home dissolves over a game of Pictionary learns early that love is unstable, that the people who are supposed to stay do not always stay, and Milhouse carries that lesson into every attachment he forms afterward. He becomes a boy who wants to be loved with an intensity that is almost frightening, and the series returns to that hunger again and again, always with the same quiet result. Go back to the third season, to Bart's Friend Falls in Love, where a new student named Samantha Stanky transfers into the 4th grade class from Phoenix. Milhouse falls in love with her instantly, completely, in the way that only a lonely child can. For a brief stretch, he is happy, and the happiness is real. But Bart, jealous of losing his friend's time, does something small and enormous. He tells Samantha's father about the relationship, and her father responds by sending her away to a convent school, St. Sebastian's School for Wicked Girls. The love is not allowed to end on its own terms. It is taken, removed, sealed behind institutional walls, and Milhouse is left heartbroken by a machinery of adult decisions he had no part in. There is one grace note. At the very end, Samantha tells him she still has feelings for him, and she gives him a goodbye kiss, and she does it despite the rules of the convent school forbidding exactly that. So even his tenderest memory is edged with prohibition, a kiss stolen against the rules, a thing he is allowed to keep only because someone broke a rule to give it to him. And then there is Lisa, the longest and saddest thread of all. Milhouse's feeling for Lisa is the show's most durable, unrequited love, and it costs him. In Lisa's date with Density, in the 8th season, Nelson beats Milhouse up and sends him to the hospital, and the reason is a mistake. Nelson believes Milhouse wrote a love note, when in fact, the note came from Lisa. Milhouse takes a beating meant for feelings that were not even his to have. He is hospitalized for a romance that exists mostly in his own longing, punished as a stand-in, hurt for wanting something he was never going to receive. There is a terrible economy to it. Even his suffering over Lisa is secondhand, a consequence of somebody else's misreading. The writers could have let that be the end of it, a running gag about a boy with a crush. Instead, it looks forward, all the way into adulthood, in Lisa's wedding, the 6th season episode that imagines Lisa grown and about to marry someone else. Adult Milhouse appears there, and he describes Lisa as his one true love. Not a childhood phase he outgrew. His one true love, still, as a grown man, spoken plainly. And the episode offers a flashback to a date between them, a date where Lisa tells him she plans never to marry, and Milhouse wells up. Hold that image for a moment. He is on a date with the person he loves most in the world, and she is gently telling him that marriage is not something she will ever do, and the tears come not because she is rejecting him specifically, but because he understands, in that moment, that the door was never going to open for anyone, least of all for him. This is why it is worth taking Milhouse seriously, rather than laughing him off. The series files him under comic relief. He is the friend, the sidekick, the boy with the thick glasses whose misfortunes land as jokes. But assemble the facts, and a different figure appears. A child of a divorce that happened over a party game, a boy consoled on a school bus by other children of divorce, a first love shipped off to a convent by a jealous best friend, a crush that put him in a hospital bed by mistake, a grown man who still names a woman who told him plainly she would never marry as his one true love. None of these are exaggerations. They are simply what the episodes show, laid end to end, and laid end to end they describe a life organized around wanting to be loved and being denied it at almost every turn. The comedy is real, and the series earns its laughs at his expense. Yet underneath the laughs is a consistency of sorrow that the writers returned to across many seasons, deliberately, from the 3rd season to the 8th and into the flash forwards. They kept giving Milhouse the same shape of story, the reaching hand and the closing door, and they kept framing it lightly enough that most of us laughed and moved on. If you slow down, though, and let the episodes speak in sequence, the quietest boy in Springfield begins to look like the one carrying the most weight, and carrying it without complaint, and carrying it while everyone around him treats his heartbreak as a punchline. He trained for 2 years at Juilliard. That is the fact most people never attach to the man in the yellow makeup, and yet it is the fact that explains everything else. Kelsey Grammer, the actor who gives Sideshow Bob his voice, entered Juilliard as one of its drama students in 1973 and studied there until 1975, and afterward he did what a young classical actor was supposed to do. He performed Shakespeare and Shaw at the Old Globe Theater in San Diego. He reached Broadway in 1981, playing Lennox in a revival of Macbeth. This is not trivia grafted onto a cartoon after the fact. It is the raw material. The cultured voice, the rolling contempt, the sense that every syllable has been weighed and found superior to its listener, all of it comes from a man who actually stood on those stages and spoke those lines. Grammer has said something else that matters here. He drew the character's manner from stories told by a theater director named Ellis Rabb, a man for whom Grammer once did home repairs. Weigh that for a moment. The voice of Sideshow Bob is partly the voice of a real director of the classical stage, remembered by an actor who once worked on his house. So when the show reaches for its most refined villain, it is not inventing refinement. It is borrowing it, faithfully, from the world of the theater. Bob is what happens when that world is dropped into a children's variety program and asked to hold a pie. Consider the shape of his grievance, because the story gives it to us plainly. Bob explains that he was nominated for Best Supporting Performer in a children's program at the Daytime Emmy Awards. He lost. He lost to something called Suck Up the Vacuum, and he names that defeat as the moment his bitterness, in his own account, ruined the greatest night of his life. Weigh the cruelty of that arrangement. A man trained in the highest register of dramatic art is placed in a category built for puppets and gimmicks, and then he is beaten, in that category, by a talking appliance. The joke is real and the joke is funny, but underneath the joke is a genuine humiliation, the humiliation of a serious artist, measured by a scale that was never built to see him. He tells the Simpson family the rest of it in the same register, and this is the part that lifts him out of ordinary villainy. He says, in effect, that prison ended his dream of doing high-quality children's programming and turned him into a seething cauldron of rage and recrimination. And then he does something no cartoon villain is required to do. He reaches for the Buddha. He frames his own ruin through the first 2 noble truths, that existence is suffering and that the cause of suffering is desire. A lesser show would have let him snarl and plot. This show lets him diagnose himself with a doctrine of renunciation, which means he understands, intellectually, exactly what has poisoned him, and understands it better than the people he wants to kill. That is not the mind of a joke. That is the mind of a tragic figure, one who can name the disease and cannot cure it. The pity of it sharpens when you notice how the town receives him. Returned to his parole hearing, the board asks whether, if released, he would pose any threat to one Bart Simpson, and Bob answers by calling Bart the spirited little scamp, who twice foiled his evil schemes and sent him to this dank, urine-soaked hellhole. Listen to the phrasing. Even his confession is composed. He cannot describe a jail cell without balancing the sentence, without choosing the vivid adjective, without the small flourish of the trained performer. The hearing is a scene of degradation, and he meets it with diction that belongs on a stage. There is something almost unbearable in that, a man who has lost everything still refusing to lose his command of language. And the town around him has no ear for any of it. A man testifies against him, a police chief, whose grievance is that Bob has no decency, that Bob called him Chief Pigum. He offers this as evidence of cruelty, and then, a beat too late, he laughs, because only now does he understand the pun. Watch the gap that opens there. Bob makes a joke sophisticated enough that its own target cannot parse it in real time, and the slowness of that laugh tells you everything about the distance between Bob's mind and the mind sitting in judgment over him. He is being paroled, or denied parole, by people who need a moment to catch a play on their own name. The hearing gives us one more testimony, and it is stranger still. A woman stands and says that Sideshow Bob tried to kill her on their honeymoon. It is a serious accusation. Yet the judge's response is not to weigh it, but to turn to the courtroom and ask, in effect, how many of the people present are thinking of killing her right at this moment? It tips its hand there, and it tips it in Bob's favor. The joke lands on her, not on him. Even the murderous accusation is bent, by the room itself, into a suggestion that she is the insufferable one. Bob's world is arranged so that his contempt is always half shared by the narrative around him, which is another way of saying the series keeps tacitly agreeing that the ordinary people are, in fact, ridiculous. Then there is the confession that seals him. When Bart accuses him in front of the family of framing Krusty the Clown for armed robbery, the crime that sent him to prison in the first place, Bob does not deny it. He says, indeed, he did. There is no squirming, no elaborate cover. He owns the act with the same flat dignity he brings to everything else, and that ownership is part of what makes him so difficult to dismiss. He is a criminal, plainly, a man who ruined an innocent to take his place. But he refuses the coward's comfort of pretending otherwise, and a villain who will not lie about his own guilt is a villain the show is asking you to take seriously. The most privately devastating fact in his whole story may be the smallest one. At that same dinner table, in the middle of being called scum by a child who has just exposed him, Bob turns to Selma Bouvier and proposes marriage. Selma, will you marry me? And she accepts. Bart calls him scum in the same scene, and it changes nothing. Here is a man whose refinement, whose training, whose Shakespeare and whose Buddha have brought him to a stranger's dinner table, exposed as a fraud, insulted by a 10-year-old, and still reaching for the one human thing that might redeem the wreckage. He wants to be loved, he proposes. It is absurd and it is genuinely sad, both at once, and the series holds those two things together without blinking. This is why Bob reads, on the whole, as the one true tragedy the series allows itself. Most of its villains are appetites with legs, and they are meant to be. Bob is different because the writers gave him a real education, a real humiliation, and a real self-awareness, and then set all three loose in a town that could never hope to appreciate any of them. His villainy is not the punchline. His villainy is the residue of everything that was wasted in him. And when you know that the voice was built out of Juilliard, out of the old Globe, out of a real director's remembered manner, the whole figure stops being funny for a moment and simply becomes a portrait of talent with nowhere left to go. For a show that would eventually turn Mr. Burns into a figure of almost geological permanence, it is worth remembering how it introduced the idea, because the introduction was tender before it was terrifying. The episode called Rosebud first aired on the 21st of October, 1993, the fourth episode of the fifth season. It was written by John Swartzwelder and directed by Wes Archer, and it fell early in David Merkin's run as the show's new executive producer. That production detail matters more than it might seem, because Rosebud is the episode that decided what kind of man Burns would be underneath the money, and everything the writers did to him afterward, including shooting him, grows out of the answer it gives here. The answer arrives in a flashback. Young Burns stands with his parents, and they make him choose. He can stay with them, or he can go and live with a twisted, loveless billionaire. This is the moment the series gently explains its own villain, not by making him evil, but by making him bought. The child leaves. He walks away from the people who love him and toward the money, and he does it without his teddy bear, an object named Bobo, which he abandons on the way out while calling it, in the language of the scene, a symbol of his lost youth and innocence. Consider what the story is doing there. It is letting a small boy narrate his own damage in the exact vocabulary a critic would use, and then it is closing the door and letting the money keep him. Everything about the older Burns is a report from the far side of that door. In the present of the episode, at his birthday, the machinery of his wealth is running at full and pointless capacity. Someone has arranged an elaborate satellite hookup so that a crowd of Australians can spell out his name using candles, a spectacle of coordinated human effort bent entirely toward flattering one man across an ocean. Burns looks at it and dismisses it. "Bah," he says, "no time, next. Register what that reveals." The show has built, for a single joke, an image of global attention organized around him, and the man at the center of it cannot spare the seconds to receive it. The wealth has grown so large that even the tributes to it bore the person they are meant to please. And underneath the boredom is the boy. Burns talks in his sleep, and what escapes him is not a business plan or a threat. It is a want. He mutters that he wants his teddy, Bobo, and then, caught by Smithers, he covers himself, claiming he actually said Lobo, referring to the canceled television show Sheriff Lobo. That correction is one of the saddest small maneuvers in the series, because a man reaches across decades in his sleep for the toy he gave up to become rich, and the moment he is observed, he reassigns the longing to a piece of forgotten television. He would rather be caught missing a canceled show than caught missing the thing he loved. The episode gives the theme its cleanest line earlier, when someone asks Burns what he wants for his birthday. He answers that he will not get what he really wants. Smithers replies that no one does. It is a throwaway exchange, delivered lightly, and it is also the whole psychology of the character stated in 2 sentences. The richest man in the series, the man who can summon a hemisphere to spell his name in fire, has arrived at the same conclusion as everyone with nothing. The money did not close the distance between wanting and having. It only made the distance visible from a greater height. So when the birthday crowd gathers and Smithers arranges for Homer to perform stand-up comedy, roasting Burns, the scene is already loaded before the first joke lands. Homer jokes that Burns is cheap and old, and the crowd, including Burns himself, turns hostile the instant he says it. This is the fragility hiding inside the fortress. A man who can absorb any amount of flattery cannot absorb being called cheap and old, because those 2 words describe the true state of the deal he made as a boy. He is old, and the youth he traded is gone, and he is cheap, because holding money tightly is the only thing the money ever taught him to do. The room turns because the joke is not a joke. It is a diagnosis, and Burns hears it as one. Hold that portrait of the man, the boy who wanted his bear and got a hemisphere of candles instead, and now watch what the show does with him once it stops looking inward and starts looking at what he does to the town. Because the theory worth sitting with tonight is this. The writers made Burns emotionally hollow so that it could make him economically unstoppable, and the 2 facts are the same fact. A man who wants nothing he can actually have will pursue the one thing that never satisfies, which is more, and he will pursue it without the ordinary human breaks of enough. You can see the machinery bare in the 2-part story that begins in the last episode of the 6th season. Springfield Elementary, of all places, strikes oil during a construction accident. Superintendent Chalmers announces that this makes it the richest elementary school in the state. For a moment, a public institution, a school, has stumbled into wealth, and you can imagine every good thing that money might buy for children. Then Burns arrives, and the story stops being about the school and starts being about him, because that is what capital does to a windfall it did not create. It comes to collect. Burns confronts Principal Skinner and demands that the school sign the oil well over to him. His justification is almost startling in its honesty. He explains that he already owns the electric company, the waterworks. Notice that word, maintain. He does not say build or start. He already has the board. The oil is not an opportunity for him. It is a threat, because it is value existing somewhere outside his grip, and a monopoly is defined by the absence of exactly that. He does not want the well because he needs oil. He wants it because a school having something is intolerable to a man whose entire identity is having everything. And when Skinner refuses to sell, the mask of commerce comes off with a speed the series plays for comedy, and that is, underneath, the honest depiction of power. "Then I will just have to attack you," Burns says, and he has Smithers hand him a golf club so that he can physically assault the principal. Look at the object chosen, a golf club, the instrument of leisure, of the country club, of the class that plays while others work, is repurposed on the spot into a weapon. When persuasion and money both fail, the last argument of accumulated wealth is simply force, delivered with the props of privilege. The episode lets you laugh and then, if you are still awake, lets you notice that nothing about the logic is exaggerated except the golf club. Running alongside the grand crime is a small and personal one, and the show keeps it deliberately small. Homer, who has worked at the plant for 10 years, is angered because Burns still does not know his name. It surfaces when Homer delivers a package and Burns misreads the return label rather than recognizing the man in front of him. 10 years of a life given to this man, and Homer is not even a name, he is a label to be squinted at. This is the same hollowness from Rosebud, viewed from below instead of within. Burns cannot love because he traded the capacity away as a child, and the practical shape of that incapacity for the people beneath him is that they do not register as people at all. The boy who could not keep his bear grew into a man who cannot keep a single employee's name. Which brings us to the shooting, and to why the town's reaction is the real subject rather than the gunshot itself. When the 7th season opens, Kent Brockman reports that Burns was shot at 3 in the afternoon on a Friday, following a tense confrontation at Town Hall, and his broadcast makes the claim that becomes the engine of the mystery. Everyone in Springfield, he says, had a reason to shoot Mr. Burns. Stay with that sentence, because it is not a plot device, it is a verdict on the man. A whole town, and not a single innocent among them where he is concerned. The mystery is not who hated him, the mystery is only which of the many. The family runs through the motives out loud, and the list is a catalog of the ways unaccountable power touches every life it passes. Burns broke Bart's dog's legs. He destroyed Grandpa's home. He could not remember Homer's name. He had Lisa's school jazz program canceled, and her friend Tito Puente fired. What is striking is the range. A dog, a home, a name, a child's music. There is no scale too small for him to have wrecked, and no person too minor to have been wronged. This is what the series understands about concentrated capital that most stories about villains miss. The harm is not one dramatic evil. It is distributed, ambient, touching the legs of a dog and the jazz program of a 9-year-old with the same casual reach it uses to seize an oil well. There is one exception, and the show is careful about it. Smithers is cleared as a suspect because his alibi is confirmed. He was watching a program called Pardon My Zinger on Comedy Central at the time of the shooting, which means he had left the town meeting early. The one man who loves Burns is the one man removed from the list of those who might have killed him. Everyone who is used has a motive. The one who is devoted has an alibi. That is a subtly perfect arrangement, because it tells you the town did not turn on Burns out of general meanness. It turned because of what he did to each of them, and the only person spared from suspicion is the only person he never treated as an instrument. So here is the shape the theory takes. The writers spent Rosebud proving that Burns cannot be reached, cannot be satisfied, cannot be loved into a smaller man, and then it spent the oil well arc proving that this same unreachable man cannot be stopped from taking, and then it gathered an entire town who all had cause to end him and pointed them at a single confrontation at Town Hall. And whatever you remember about how the mystery resolves, The structure the writers built is unmistakable. It made a man who feels nothing, gave him everything, let him harm everyone, and set the whole town against him. A person built that way does not really end when he is shot. He is the part of the world that outlasts the people angry at it. The boy who let go of his bear and, in exchange, was promised he would never have to let go of anything else. There is a moment in Flaming Moe's, early in Season 3, where Moe explains to Homer why the tavern is doing so badly, and the explanation is worth sitting with. Business is poor, he says, because people are healthier and drinking less. Higher job satisfaction, more time spent with family, the small improvements that most people would call a good life. All of it registers to Moe as loss. He frames togetherness and contentment as, in his words, poison for a purveyor of mind-numbing intoxicants. Consider that as a foundation for a character. His livelihood depends on other people being miserable enough to sit in his bar, and the healthier and happier the town becomes, the closer he moves toward ruin. The joke is fast, and it plays as a throwaway, but it establishes something the writers would return to for decades. Moe is a man whose survival is tied to everyone else's unhappiness, and who cannot escape his own. The same episode piles the failure higher. Moe has fallen behind on his beer payments, and his distributor has cut him off. His response, the choice that supposedly caused the crisis, was to spend his last $10,000 on a love tester arcade machine, one of those novelty devices that rates a person's romantic heat by how long they can grip a handle. Barney, of course, sucked the machine dry, played it into uselessness, and now Moe stands behind a bar with no beer to sell and no money to buy any. There is a bleak symmetry in the specifics. A man who cannot connect with anyone spends everything he has on a machine that measures desire, and the only person who uses it is a hopeless drunk. The tavern that runs on other people's loneliness is itself broke, cut off, and empty. And when a woman comes in to apply for a bartending job, Moe hands her a version of the world as he understands it. Instead of the standard questions a job application would ask, he tells her to fill in her name, her measurements, and her turn-ons. He lists, as a fringe benefit of the position, an unforgettable weekend at Club Moe. It is presented as a gag about a sleazy man being sleazy, and it works on that level, but underneath the leer is the same emptiness. This is a person who has no ordinary language for closeness, who cannot ask for company without turning it into a transaction or a joke, and who dresses up desperate isolation as a boast. The bar is a place he built to be surrounded by people, and he is more alone inside it than anyone. Years later, in Crook and Ladder, from season 18, the show gives that loneliness a different shape. Springfield's professional firefighters are gone, and a makeshift civilian fire department forms to fill the gap. Moe volunteers. He is eventually dubbed Fire Chief Moe, though the group first turns him away, dismissing him as a lousy civilian, and in that rejection he mutters something to himself that the writers let hang in the air. He says that he wishes he could burn them all. It is the kind of line the series drops and moves past, but consider how much weight it carries coming from him. A man starved for belonging is refused a place, and the refusal curdles instantly into a fantasy of destruction. The anger and the need are the same feeling wearing two faces. Once he is inside, the role consumes him, because it gives him the one thing his life does not. When his family, such as it is, expects him at dinner, Moe cannot come, because the fire siren, he explains, could sound at any moment. He scans the town obsessively, hunting for a real fire, and in his desperation, he mistakes a backyard barbecue for a blaze, mistakes a man with red hair for flames. What he is chasing is not fire, it is purpose. It is the excitement and the sense of being needed that the role hands him, and he grips it with the same white-knuckled fervor as a drowning man. The comedy is in the false alarms. The sadness is in why he wants them so badly. To take Moe seriously as a character, you have to look at how the series itself describes him, and the description is remarkably direct. His profile notes that his mood rapidly vacillates between anger, indifference, and suicidal despair, and it adds that this trait has become more apparent in later episodes of the run. That is a striking thing to say about a figure who exists mostly for jokes. Anger, indifference, and despair are not comic modes. They are the recognizable shape of a person in genuine trouble, and the writers placed all three inside a bartender and let them swing back and forth for laughs. What is worth pausing on is the admission that it grew more apparent over time. The writers did not soften Mo as the years passed. They leaned further in. Nowhere is that clearer than in the running suicide gag, which the show returned to again and again, always failing, always played for comedy. Mo attempts to end his life, and something absurd intervenes. In one instance, he jumps from a plane and survives by landing on a hot air balloon. The structure of the joke is that he cannot even manage this, that the universe keeps him alive out of what looks like indifference rather than mercy. Set beside that is another running gag, quieter and somehow heavier, in which it is established that Mo has called a suicide crisis hotline so many times that the hotline blocked his number. Follow the logic of that for a moment. The one lifeline built specifically for people in his exact condition has, in the world of the story, cut him off, the same way his beer distributor cut him off, the same way the fire department first waved him away. Every institution designed to catch a person lets Mo fall through. The most famous instance is gentler, and it turns the gag into a hinge for a whole story. In Mo Baby Blues, from season 14, Mo is shown standing on a bridge, preparing to jump to his death. Before he can, a traffic accident sends baby Maggie Simpson flying through a car's sunroof, and Mo, by chance, catches her. That catch is what starts the episode. The plot that follows, Mo's unlikely bond with the baby, only exists because he happened to be on that bridge at that moment for that reason. The program uses his lowest point as a plot mechanism, the accident of his despair placing him exactly where a falling child needs a pair of hands. It is played tenderly, and it is one of the warmer things the series ever did with him. But the warmth is built directly on top of the darkness, and it does not pretend otherwise. For a long time, the question of why Mo is the way he is went unanswered, which suited the writers, because a man's misery is funnier when it has no cause you can point to. Then, in an episode that aired on the 15th of April, 2018, the series finally introduced Mo's father, a man named Morty Shislak, voiced by Ray Liotta. The revelation that came with him was almost mundane in its cruelty. The family once ran a chain of mattress stores, and that chain was reduced to only 3 locations after a business rival infested it with bedbugs. It is a small, grubby, specific kind of ruin, the failure of a family business through sabotage, and it slots neatly into everything that came before. Mo inherited a failing enterprise and a father who presided over its collapse. The purveyor of mind-numbing intoxicants who cannot keep his bar solvent came from a family that could not keep its stores standing either. What emerges, when you lay these pieces beside one another, is a portrait the show assembled slowly and never quite let anyone look at directly. A perpetually failing business, a childhood shaped by a father and a family in decline, a mood that swings between rage and numbness, and a despair the writers themselves named, a hotline that stopped taking his calls, a bridge that became, of all things, the place he saved a baby. Mo is the running joke that the series kept sharpening rather than dulling, and the closer you look at the punchline, the more you see it was never really a joke about a bad bartender. It was a joke, told patiently across 30 years, about a man nobody could reach. Some performers cannot stand the very thing they do best, and Krusty the Clown is the show's fullest portrait of him. The earlier stories about Springfield's entertainment machine looked outward, at what an industry hides and what it gets away with. This one turns the camera around. What sits behind Krusty is not a scandal to be buried, but a wound he carries into the studio every day. And the theory worth sitting with here is that his cruelty toward his audience is the same cruelty he learned to aim at himself. Begin with a phone call, because that is where the coldness first shows itself as ordinary. In the episode that first aired on Fox in October of 1991, written by Jay Kogan and Wallace Wolodarski, and directed by Jeffrey Lynch and Brad Bird, Bart tries to have dinner with the man he worships. It does not happen once. It does not happen twice. Krusty cancels 5 times in a row, a fact the audience learns not from Krusty himself, but from a conversation between his assistant, Miss Pennycandy, and Marge, before he finally agrees to come. Think about what that arrangement means. The man who built an empire on the love of children cannot bring himself to sit across from one of them, and the refusal is handled at a remove, by staff, the way a busy man declines a meeting he never intended to keep. Bart's response is the first crack in the worship, and it is worth quoting because the writing gives a child the vocabulary of despair. He writes Krusty a letter renouncing him, calling himself, in his own words, just another number on a fan club roster Krusty never really looked at. The membership number is the joke and the knife at once, because it reminds you that Bart's devotion was always one of millions, cataloged and sold. And then the letter turns, and a 10-year-old writes something no 10-year-old should be able to write. He says he always suspected that nothing in life mattered, and now he knows for sure, and he signs off, in effect, telling Krusty to get bent. That is the voice of a fan who has understood, too early, that the performer he loved does not love him back. It is the audience's disillusionment stated plainly, and the rest of the episode is the series explaining why the performer became this way. The explanation arrives at the Simpsons dinner table, and it arrives in a language nobody at that table expects. Krusty is asked to say grace. He recites it in Hebrew, the blessing that begins Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam hamotzi lechem min ha'aretz, and it is through this small, unguarded act that the family and the audience learn that Krusty is Jewish. Notice how the revelation works. It does not come through a confession or a plot twist. It comes through a prayer, a thing so deeply grooved into him by childhood that it surfaces the moment he is asked to bless bread. Whatever he has built over the man he was, the oldest layer is still there, and it speaks without his permission. From that blessing, the history unspools. Krusty reveals that his real name is Herschel Kristofsky, and that his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather were all rabbis. Consider the weight of that lineage for a moment. 3 generations of men whose work was to stand before a congregation and speak, to hold attention, to give words that mattered. Krusty inherited the stage and threw away the sermon. He kept the gesture of the pulpit and filled it with pie and honking and grease paint, and the distance between what his family did with an audience and what he does with one is the distance the whole episode is measuring. He tells them how the break happened. As a boy, when he asked to become a clown, his father told him that a clown is not respected, and threatened him, in his own remembered words, that he would get such a zets that he would not even know what hit him. Respect is the exact thing at stake, and it is the exact thing Krusty spends his adult life failing to secure. His father drew a line between the dignified use of an audience and the undignified one, and Krusty crossed it, and some part of him agreed with the verdict even as he defied it. That is the seed of the self-loathing theory. He did not become a clown in innocent joy. He became one against a father who told him the profession was beneath contempt, and he has never fully stopped hearing that voice. There is a detail here that is almost unbearably neat, and the writing earns it. Krusty says he got his first laughs at yeshiva by impersonating his father, doing a bit he remembers as blah 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 Moses. His comedy was born as mockery of the very man whose respect he wanted. The first thing that ever made a room laugh at Herschel Kristofsky was Herschel making his father into a fool. Every laugh he has chased since is descended from that one, and every one of them is, at its root, an act of disrespect aimed at the person he most wanted to be respected by. A performer whose entire craft grew out of ridiculing his father is a performer with a complicated relationship to applause. And then, the line that tells you the wound is still open. Krusty says that reciting the Hebrew blessing brings back a lot of painful memories of his father. Not fond memories. Painful ones. The prayer that gave him away also hurt him, and he says so at the table, quietly, to a family of strangers. This is the most honest we ever see him. Stripped of the studio and the makeup, asked only to bless bread, he tells the truth about what the tradition costs him, and the truth is grief. Now carry that man forward across years of episodes to a moment where the wound has hardened into something meaner, and watch what a lifetime of that unresolved contempt does to how he treats the people who love him. In a much later episode, Krusty is doing a live sketch while network executives feed him notes, and something in him finally breaks in public. He snaps at them and announces on the air that Friday's show will be his last. He says, in effect, that he has been in show business for 61 years and does not need 12 suits telling him which way to pee. It is easy to read that as the industry angle, the artist against his handlers, and the earlier videos would have read it that way. But watch who else he turns on, because that is where the theory holds. He turns on the audience's proxy, the newsman sent to cover him. He dismisses Kent Brockman on the air as a tiresome tot-sitter and adds, with the strange precision of a man who has thought about it, that he was the risible one in their dyad. Read that slowly. He is not only insulting Brockman, he is claiming the role of the laughable one for himself, naming his own function as the object of ridicule, the way he once made his father the object of ridicule at yeshiva. The self-contempt has become a boast. He wears risible as a title. The clown his father said would never be respected has decided, out loud, that being laughable was the whole point, and there is no warmth in the way he says it. The cruelest fact comes last, and it is aimed squarely at the work itself. Krusty tells Brockman that he taped over all of his own old episodes to record Judge Judy, because keeping them around never seemed worth the cost of a blank tape, and he calls the erased episodes no big loss. Consider what a normal performer feels about his archive. It is the record of a life's work, the thing that outlasts him. Krusty destroyed his to save the price of a fresh cassette, and then told a reporter it was worth nothing. That is not carelessness. That is a man agreeing, decades later, with his father's original verdict. A clown is not respected, and the clown himself, having built the whole empire, looks back at all of it and sees nothing worth keeping. This is what separates Krusty's story from the cover-ups and the controversies. Those were about what a system does to protect itself. This is about what a man does to himself, in front of everyone, for a living. The estrangement from the Rabbi father and the contempt for the audience are not two facts about Krusty. They are one fact seen at two ages. The boy who won laughs by mocking the father he loved became the old man who mocks the audience that loves him and taped over the proof that any of it ever mattered. He learned that his work was beneath respect from the first person whose respect he needed, and he has spent his career proving that person right, one show at a time, because agreeing with the wound is easier than healing it. Somewhere under the grease paint, in a language he cannot unlearn, he is still blessing the bread and remembering that it hurts. Consider how little was decided in advance. Groundskeeper Willie did not arrive fully formed, did not step onto the program with a history or a homeland or even a nation to call his own. His first appearance came in the Season 2 episode Principal Charming, which aired in February of 1991, and many people who love this show still misremember that debut, placing him instead in the earlier episode about Bart in France. That is not where he began. He began as a small piece of background, an angry janitor with no fixed identity, written to appear once and then vanish. The Scottishness that now feels inseparable from him was an accident of the recording booth. When Dan Castellaneta sat down to give the character a voice, he reached first for a Spanish accent, then for what has been described as a big dumb Swede, and only on the third attempt landed on the angry Scottish growl that the director Sam Simon approved. Consider what that tells us. The whole heritage that fans would later map onto a real place, a real loss, a real history, was chosen in a moment, from a short menu of options, for no deeper reason than that it sounded right. Willie was meant to be thrown away. He was not thrown away. The one shot became a fixture, and once a throwaway character keeps returning, the writers begin to owe him a life. Over years, that life accumulated. His full name was set down in the show's canon as William McDougall, and at times he is addressed more grandly as Dr. William McDougall. a title that sits strangely on a man who mops floors and sleeps in a shack. His origins were pinned to a specific place, Kirkwall in Orkney, off the north coast of Scotland, established in the episode The Daughter Also Rises from 2012. His parents were brought on screen in the episode Monty Can't Buy Me Love, shown living near Loch Ness. A man assembled backward, in other words. First the voice, then the temper, then slowly the family and the town and the name. The inspirations behind him were themselves borrowed and comic. Matt Groening has said Willie owes something to Angus Crock, a kilt-wearing chef played by Dave Thomas on the sketch program Sec TV, and something to Jimmy Finlayson, the mustachioed Scottish actor who turned up in 33 Laurel and Hardy films. So the raw material was never tragedy, it was parody. He was built from two figures whose entire function was to be laughed at, the blustering Scot as a unit of comedy, the exaggerated brogue, and the flaring rage as a reliable source of noise. Hold that thought, because it matters to the theory this chapter is here to weigh. The theory goes like this, and I want to be clear that it is a reading and not a fact the writers ever confirmed. Some viewers look at Willie and see a broken man. They see the isolation, the shack at the edge of the school grounds, the sudden eruptions of fury, the way he seems always braced for an attack that is not coming, and they conclude that he is a portrait of shell shock, of a mind that has come back from something terrible and never fully returned. War trauma, some say, old damage the show never names but keeps gesturing at through his behavior. And the series, in this reading, does not treat that damage as wound, it treats it as punchline. Here is what I find genuinely uneasy about that lens, and I offer it as opinion. If you accept even the possibility that Willie is written as a damaged man, then everything about how he was made starts to cut the other way. Remember that his rage was selected in a recording booth as the funny option, chosen over a Spanish accent and a dopey Swede, because anger read as the biggest laugh. The trembling volatility that a viewer might later interpret as trauma was, at its origin, simply the loudest available joke. That does not disprove the theory. In a way, it deepens it. It means the very quality a sympathetic viewer would read as pain is the same quality the production valued for its comedy. The wound and the gag occupy the same place in him. And notice how his biography was filled in. A man does not usually receive a hometown and a set of parents years after we first meet his fury. Usually the life comes first, and the behavior follows from it. With Willie, the order reversed. We were given the shouting, the kilt, the shovel, the readiness to fight, long before Kirkwall existed for him, long before those parents by the loch were drawn. So when the theory asks us to trace his breakdowns back to some origin, the honest answer is that the breakdowns came first, and the origin was added afterward, almost as decoration. There is no buried event the writers were building toward. There is a comic temperament that later got a passport and a childhood address stapled to it. That is, I think, the quiet sadness underneath the whole idea, and it is a sadness about how the character was assembled rather than about anything that happened to him inside the story. Willie is a man whose nationality was an improvisation, whose ancestors are two vaudevillian Scotsmen from old comedy programs, whose entire interior was reverse-engineered from a voice that a director happened to like on the third try. The theory wants him to be a person carrying something. The record shows a joke that kept being asked back until it needed a history and then was handed one. Whether you find that comforting or bleak probably depends on how seriously you think a cartoon can hold a real interior. What I will say is that the facts do not support the strong version of the legend. Nothing in his verified origin points to a war, to a specific trauma, to a documented breakdown with a documented cause. What the facts support is stranger and, to me, more interesting. They support the picture of a figure whose most human-seeming trait, his fragility, his fury, his sense of a man perpetually under siege, was there before he was ever a man at all. It was there when he was just an accent. Dr. William McDougall of Kirkwall, son of a couple living in the shadow of a lake famous for a monster nobody can prove exists, is a person the series discovered it had accidentally created and then slowly took responsibility for. You can read that as trauma if you wish. You can also read it as the ordinary, slightly melancholy way that a throwaway becomes a life. One recording session, one canon detail, one returning appearance at a time. Consider how long the Bouvier sisters have been standing at the edge of the family photograph. Patty and Selma appear in the show's very first aired episode, Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, which reached television on the 17th of December 1989. They are there at the beginning, twin fixtures of disapproval, chain-smoking their way through Homer's every failure. And it would be more than 15 years before the writers let one of them say aloud what she had known about herself the whole time. That gap, that long silence stretched across more than a decade and a half of episodes, is the quiet fact this chapter turns on. The jokes came first, for years and years, and the truth arrived late, almost as an afterthought, and understanding the sisters means holding both of those things at once. Begin with Selma, because the series spends so much of its early energy convincing us that Selma is the one who wants out. In the second season, in the episode credited as Season 2, Episode 14, Selma comes to Marge in something close to panic. She tells her sister that she is, in her own framing, getting older and uglier, and she begs for help finding a man before it is too late. There is a rawness to that admission that the deadpan usually hides. This is not a woman making a joke about loneliness. This is a woman naming a fear about her own body and her own future, and asking her married sister to do something about it. And Marge, moved or perhaps simply cornered, turns to Homer, who happens to owe her a debt from a past favor, and orders him to pay it off by finding Selma a husband. The specifications are exact. The man must be, in Marge's words, honest and caring and well-off and handsome. It is a shopping list for a person, and Homer, of all people, is the one sent to fill it. Homer is almost comically unfit for the assignment, and the series knows it. He cannot even keep his sisters-in-law straight. At one point, he simply asks which one is Selma, as though they were interchangeable, and he tries to sort them by fragments of trivia he has half retained. One of them, he recalls, likes the Police Academy movies and walks in the park in autumn. The other, he notes, did not like to be touched. Think about how much is buried in that second detail, dropped in as a throwaway. A woman who does not like to be touched, filed away by Homer as an inconvenient quirk, the kind of thing that makes matchmaking harder. He is not curious about it. Nobody in that house is curious about it. It is simply a fact about one of the sisters, no more examined than her taste in films. The cruelty of Selma's situation is not really Homer's cruelty, which is only carelessness. It is the family's, and it is delivered with a smile. At the wedding of a couple, the episode names as Stanley and Martha Peterson, a family member turns to Selma and asks whether she will ever get married. Selma answers that she does not know, which is an honest and vulnerable thing to say at someone else's wedding. And then the groom, Stanley, offers what he clearly imagines to be kindness. He says he hopes she is one of the statistically small number of single 40-year-olds who find their fair prince. Dwell on that. It is pity dressed as encouragement, delivered in front of the whole family. At the exact moment a woman has confessed she does not know if she will ever have what everyone in that room already has. He reduces her to an actuarial long shot and calls it hope. The joke lands on Selma, and Selma has to keep smiling. Inside the same episode, the show draws a line between the two sisters that, in hindsight, is the most interesting thing it says. Marge, explaining her sisters to Homer, tells him that Patty chose celibacy, but Selma simply had it thrust upon her. It is a throwaway distinction, meant to help Homer aim his matchmaking at the right target. But listen to what it actually claims. Patty's singleness is framed as a decision, an act of will, a door she closed herself. Selma's is framed as misfortune, something that happened to her. In 1991, the series has no intention of explaining why Patty would choose that door. It offers the word celibacy and moves on. Only years later does the reason become available, and when it does, Marge's early line reads less like an insult and more like the family's polite way of not seeing what was in front of them. Patty did not choose to be alone. Patty chose not to pretend. The engine of the plot only makes the theme sharper. Homer, still working off his debt, invites Principal Skinner to a Simpson family dinner. He sells it to Skinner as payback for punishing Bart, a bit of neighborly hosting, but the real purpose is to set Skinner up with one of the sisters. When Skinner is asked whether he is married, he answers that he is married only to his job, and there is something almost fraternal in that line, one lonely person recognizing another. Homer, being Homer, cannot keep the sisters straight even now, and the setup misfires. Skinner ends up courting Patty rather than Selma, the wrong sister, and the series, having sent its matchmaker after the woman who desperately wanted a husband, lands him instead on the woman it has just told us chose to be alone. What happens next is the episode's real statement, and it belongs entirely to Patty. Skinner, smitten, proposes to her in the grandest gesture the writers can stage. He has the words, "Marry me, Patty," burned into the lawn of the school, a public declaration visible from above, the kind of thing that in a different story would end in tears of joy. And Patty turns him down. She tells him that the bond with her sister matters more. In 1991, that reads as devotion between twins, and it is that. But read it again, with everything the show would eventually reveal, and it becomes something else too. Patty says no to a good man who wants her, calmly, without regret, and gives a reason that is true but incomplete. She is protecting something. The family hears sisterhood. The truth is quieter and further down. That truth does not surface until the 16th season. In the episode, There's Something About Marrying. Production on it began in March of 2004, and the writers took their cue directly from the same-sex weddings that had been performed in San Francisco earlier that year. The town legalizes same-sex marriage, and into that opening walks Patty, who comes out to her family as a lesbian. She reveals that she is in a relationship with a professional golfer named Veronica, and she asks Homer, who by then has ordained himself a minister, to marry them. After decades of standing at the edge of the frame, Patty steps forward and asks the family to witness her happiness rather than pity her solitude. It is the answer to Marge's old line about chosen celibacy, arriving 13 years after the line was spoken. And then the series flinches. Veronica, it turns out, is secretly a man named Leslie Robin Swisher, competing on the women's golf tour in disguise. The character was written as a parody of the real transgender professional golfer Mian Bagger. When the disguise unravels and Leslie still proposes to Patty, Patty rejects him with the line, quoted exactly, "Hell no, I like girls." There is a real dignity in how the series handles that final beat, whatever one thinks of the machinery that produces it. Patty's coming out is not made contingent on the relationship. The relationship collapses, the person she loved turns out to be someone else entirely, and her sexuality does not waver for a second. She likes girls. She said so, and the twist that destroys her romance only confirms it. The theory that these sisters carry a hidden, long-buried unhappiness under the jokes is answered here not with more unhappiness, but with a woman refusing, at last, to be defined by a man's presence or absence. The episode did not land cleanly, and it would be dishonest to pretend it did. The response was mixed. GLAAD and the site After Ellen reacted positively to the moment of Patty coming out. Other commentary, including from LGBTQ Nation, criticized the depiction as transphobic, largely for the Veronica and Leslie twist, and what it did with a character modeled on a real trans athlete. Both of those reactions are true at once. The series gave one of its oldest characters a genuine, long-delayed moment of honesty, and it wrapped that moment inside a gag about disguise that used a real person's life as the punchline. That contradiction is the show in miniature, capable of tenderness and carelessness in the same half hour, exactly as Homer was capable of both toward these women 15 years earlier. Which returns us to where the sisters started. For more than 15 years, the writers let Patty be the one who chose celibacy, the deadpan spinster with the cigarette and the frown, and it let Selma be the one begging Homer to find her a husband before it was too late. The jokes were the surface, and the surface held for a very long time. Underneath, one sister was alone because no one saw her, and the other was alone because she could not yet be seen. The wedding pity and the burned-up lawn and the throwaway line about a woman who did not like to be touched were all pointing at something the show would not name for over a decade. When it finally did, it did so imperfectly, and the imperfection is part of the record. But the answer, when it came, was Patty saying plainly that she liked girls, and turning down a proposal that was never going to be the truth about her life. Consider what a memory does to the person who holds it. In an early episode built entirely around their arrangement, there is a small exchange that most viewers would let pass without a second thought, and it tells you almost everything about the relationship between Waylon Smithers and Charles Montgomery Burns. Burns asks where the union representative has gone, and Smithers answers at once that he does not know, that the man has not been seen since he promised to clean up the union. There is no pause in it, no searching. The information is simply there, already retrieved, waiting to be handed over the instant it is wanted. Smithers is not a man who looks things up. He is a man who already knows. The same episode gives us the mirror image of that devotion, and the mirror is cruel. Burns looks at Homer Simpson and does not recognize him. He asks who that firebrand is, as though seeing a stranger, and Smithers, without hesitation, recites the history. He reminds Burns that this is the man who thwarted his campaign for governor, the man his car once ran over, the man who saved the plant from a meltdown, the man whose wife painted Burns in the nude. It is a complete dossier, delivered from memory, every collision between these two lives catalogued and kept. And Burns listens to all of it and says only that it does not ring a bell. Pause on that for a moment. Smithers carries the entire record of Burns's life, including the parts Burns himself has discarded, and Burns cannot summon a single thread of it. The devotion runs in one direction and evaporates on arrival. Everything Smithers knows is knowledge in service of a man who retains nothing in return, not even the enemies who nearly destroyed him. Smithers remembers Burns's world more faithfully than Burns does. That is not assistance. That is a form of self-erasure, an identity spent entirely on holding another person's memories so that person does not have to. The character has been voiced across all of this by Harry Shearer, and the ambiguity at the center of Smithers was there almost from the beginning, planted deliberately and quietly. The idea that Smithers is gay was first pitched by Sam Simon, one of the show's co-developers, who suggested the writers simply keep it in the back of their heads rather than draw attention to it. It was never meant to be an announcement. It was meant to be a truth the writers carried without stating, the way Smithers carries so much without stating. And for years, that is exactly how the producers handled it. When asked directly, they described Smithers not as gay, but as, in their word, Burns sexual. It was a clever formulation, and it deflected the question, and it also happens to be the most honest thing anyone said about him for a long time. Think about what that phrase actually claims. It says the man's orientation is not toward a gender or a type, but toward a single other person, that his entire capacity for desire has been routed through one narrow channel and given a name that erases everyone else. Whatever else that word was, it was accurate. Smithers's identity had been folded so completely into his loyalty that even the writers could not describe who he was without describing who he served. That is the quiet tragedy the series let sit for decades. A man whose feelings were real, whose memory was perfect, whose devotion never wavered, and whose selfhood was permitted to exist only as an appendage of another man's ego. The joke was funny. The joke was also a person disappearing inside it. Then, by most accounts sometime in early 2016, the writers finally said the thing plainly. In an episode of season 27 titled The Burns Cage, written by Rob Lazebnik and directed by Rob Oliver, Smithers officially came out as gay. After all the years of ambiguity, after the careful deflections, the text made explicit what Sam Simon had asked the writers to keep in the backs of their heads. But notice what the episode does not do. It does not grant Smithers the release you might expect from such a moment. He is devastated by Burns's lack of affection, and it is that devastation, not any joy, that drives the story. Homer, seeing the state of him, tries to find him a boyfriend, as though the answer to loving the wrong man is simply to supply a different one. And then comes the skydiving accident. Smithers saves Burns's life, which is the thing he has always done in one form or another, and in the aftermath he almost declares his love. Almost. He comes to the edge of finally saying it. And Burns, given that opening, reaffirms his indifference and his ingratitude. The man whose life was just saved responds with the same coldness he has always shown. The coming out episode, the one that was supposed to resolve decades of the unspoken, ends by confirming that the central relationship of Smithers's life will never be returned. He can name himself now. What he cannot do is change the arithmetic. The devotion still runs one way, and it still evaporates on arrival, exactly as it did back in Season 4 when he recited a history that did not ring a bell. That, I think, is the real theory of Waylon Smithers, and it is a bleaker one than the ambiguity ever was. The tragedy was never that the writers would not confirm he was gay. The tragedy is that his identity, whatever it was and whoever he named it toward, had been so thoroughly organized around one indifferent man that even the truth, once spoken, could not free him from him. He knew everything about Burns. Burns knew nothing of him. And when Smithers finally stood at the edge of saying who he was and what he felt, the answer he received was the answer he had always received, which was no answer at all. A classroom can produce a particular kind of laughter, and Ralph Wiggum lives inside it. In the episode from the 4th season, we watch him fail at the smallest tasks a child is asked to perform, and we watch the room respond. He does not have a red crayon. When Miss Hoover asks him where it went, he explains that he ate it, and the class laughs. A moment later, he offers that his parents will not let him use scissors, and rather than soften this, the teacher confirms the cruelty out loud. She tells the class, in words the script gives us plainly, that the children are right to laugh at him, and then she hands out dull scissors, as though the whole exchange has resolved something. Consider the size of that. The one adult in the room, the person whose job is to protect a small child from the mob, endorses the mob instead. It is easy to file Ralph under comic relief and move on. The show invites that. His non sequiturs are engineered to land, and they do. But if you hold the crayon and the scissors together for a moment, a quieter shape appears underneath the joke. A child who eats a crayon is a child who is hungry in some way, or unsupervised, or both. A child whose parents will not let him use scissors is a child whose home has decided he cannot be trusted with the ordinary tools of being 6. These are not the details of a happy household described from the outside. They are the small leakages of a home that is failing him, delivered as punchlines so that we laugh before we notice. The Valentine sequence is where the program lets the mask slip furthest. After the class exchange, Ralph is shown crying because he appears to have received nothing. Every other child has a small pile, and he has the visible absence of one. This is the loneliness that his whole character has been steadily built on, made literal for a moment on his face. Then Lisa, moved by the sight of him, gives him hers. The card reads, "Choo choo choose me," with a picture of a train, and Ralph responds with a disbelief that is almost painful to watch, repeating the phrase back as a question, as though kindness aimed at him must be a mistake he needs to confirm. "You choo choo choose me?" That is not the reaction of a child who is used to being chosen. And here the writing does something honest and a little merciless. In an aside, Lisa admits that she only gave him the card because she felt sorry for him, and not because she likes him. So the single moment of tenderness Ralph receives is, by the giver's own private account, pity rather than affection. He cannot tell the difference. He has so little to compare it to that pity registers as love. Later, walking her home in the certain belief that they are now a couple, he shares the kind of detail that no one has taught him to keep to himself. His doctor, he tells her, said his nosebleeds would stop if he kept his finger out of his nose. It is a joke, and it is funny. And it is also the portrait of a boy narrating his own untended body to the first person who has shown him a scrap of warmth. Nobody at home, it seems, is managing the nosebleeds. Nobody is managing much of anything. I want to linger on that reading rather than rush past it, because the series never states it. Ralph is neglect rendered as whimsy. The laughter that follows him everywhere is the same laughter Miss Hoover blessed in that classroom. And once you have heard the teacher say the children are right to laugh, you cannot fully unhear it under any of his lines afterward. Now turn to a different kid, in a different season, wearing what looks like the opposite face. Nelson Muntz is not the boy the class laughs at. He is the boy the class fears. The bully whose name is a threat. In the episode from the 8th season, Principal Skinner works out, through what he calls a process of elimination, that Nelson is the last and most obvious suspect in the theft of the H emblem from his Honda. Skinner calls him the bottom of the barrel. When he opens Nelson's locker, he finds it filled with stolen goods, and he describes what he sees as a principal's ransom in stolen goods. The evidence is overwhelming, and the response is procedural. A week of janitorial work under groundskeeper Willie. Return the items. Apologize. On the surface, these two children could not be more different. One is soft and the other is hard. One eats crayons and the other empties lockers. But listen to how Nelson answers when he is confronted about his behavior and his reputation. He does not explain himself, and he does not plead. He fires off refusals, telling the adults in effect to leave him alone, with lines the script gives us verbatim. Bite me. Cram it. Get bent, ma'am. That last one is the tell. The reflexive, almost formal contempt of a child who has learned that adults are not on his side, and who has built his entire manner out of getting to the insult before anyone can get to him. What the show establishes about Nelson, and what makes him the right companion for Ralph in this chapter, is that his hardness has a source. He is a boy shaped by a father who left. The abandonment is the ground he stands on, and everything the school sees as delinquency grows out of it. The stolen goods in the locker are not the acquisitions of a greedy child. They are the collections of a child raising himself, taking what is not given, filling an absence with objects because the person who should have filled it is gone. Skinner sees a suspect at the bottom of the barrel. He does not see the reason the barrel exists. Set the two boys side by side, and the pattern that this chapter is after comes clear. Ralph absorbs neglect and turns it inward, into oblivious tenderness, into a crayon eaten, and a nosebleed narrated, and a pity valentine mistaken for love. Nelson absorbs neglect and turns it outward, into fists and insults and a locker full of what other people owned. Same wound, opposite direction. And in both cases, the institutions around them respond to the symptom and never the injury. Miss Hoover ratifies the laughter. Skinner assigns the janitorial week. Neither adult asks what a 6-year-old is doing eating a crayon, or what has become of the father who is not there to notice the emblem his son has stolen. The Simpsons built both of these children as comic engines. Ralph delivers the absurd line, Nelson delivers the ha-ha, and the town runs on both. That is the genius and the cover. Because a joke asks nothing further of you. It closes the moment it lands. But if you slow the episodes down, as we are doing now in the dark, the jokes stop closing. You start to see that it has softly told you, in the 4th season and again in the 8th, that its 2 funniest children are its 2 loneliest, and that the room keeps laughing because no one in it has decided to look after them. Ralph and Nelson are not comic relief from the sadness of Springfield. They are the sadness, wearing the only 2 masks a neglected child has available. One smiles, one snarls. Both are waiting for someone to choose them, and both, so far, have been handed dull scissors instead. The family gathers around Maggie in the opening of the episode from season 4, and they do what families do with a baby who has not yet spoken. They prompt her. They lean in close and offer her the easy words, the first words, the ones that are meant to come without effort. Say Baba, they tell her. Say Mama, say Daddy. And Maggie answers, but not with any of those. She babbles a run of nonsense sounds, an imitation of noise rather than language, catching fragments of what is around her and giving them back distorted. She mimics something like bebop. She returns something that sounds like shove it. She produces a belch. She never says a real word on screen, not one, and the family eventually stops listening for it. Consider how gently the show frames this as a problem to be managed rather than a silence to be understood. A family member reaches for a magazine, Fretful Mother magazine, and reads out its verdict as though it were medicine. If Maggie does not talk by the age of 1, the magazine advises, they should consider a corrective tongue extender. It is a joke, of course, an absurd invented device for an invented anxiety, and yet listen to what the joke assumes. It assumes the silence is a defect in the machinery of the mouth. It assumes there is something to be corrected, some physical obstruction between the child and the words she is supposed to produce. The possibility that a child might simply not be speaking, that the silence might belong to her rather than to a faulty tongue, is not entertained. The magazine wants a mechanism. It wants a fix. Homer worries about it in his own way, which is to worry aloud and briefly. And Marge, in answer, offers him a proverb. "It is better to remain silent and be thought a fool," she says, "than to open your mouth and remove all doubt." It is an old line, a piece of received wisdom about the wisdom of holding one's tongue, and Marge produces it as comfort, as though Maggie's silence might be a form of discretion rather than a form of absence. Lisa, standing nearby, admits privately that she does not understand it. And that small admission is worth sitting with. The one child in this family who does speak, who speaks constantly and precisely, and often above the heads of everyone around her, cannot make sense of the proverb offered to explain the child who does not speak at all. The saying is meant to dignify silence. It does not quite land, and Lisa knows it does not, and she keeps that to herself. Then the conversation turns, as these conversations do, to first words. Someone asks Homer what his own first word was, and he cannot remember it. So Marge fills the silence with a story, and here is the detail I want you to hold on to. She does not tell the story of Maggie's first word, because there is no such story to tell. She tells the story of Lisa's first word instead. The whole episode, an episode ostensibly gathered around this baby who will not speak, gently slides away from her and onto her older sister, onto the child whose language arrived and can be narrated. Maggie becomes the occasion for a memory that is not about her. She is the reason they are all talking, and she is the one person the talking leaves behind. The flashback Marge opens is set before Lisa was born, in a smaller and poorer version of the family, and it carries something the later theory will need. When Marge tells Homer that they are going to have another baby, his first reaction is not joy and not fear. He misreads her entirely. He asks, in effect, whether the announcement means they will start doing it in the morning, hearing news of a pregnancy as news about sex. The distance between what Marge is saying and what Homer receives is the whole comedy of the moment, and it is also a quiet pattern. Pregnancy, in this house, arrives as something that has to be understood a second time, after the first understanding fails. And Homer's practical mind, once it catches up, does not reach for a larger life. It reaches for a smaller accommodation. He proposes that Bart simply sleep in his and Marge's bed until he is 21, citing some vague family precedent, rather than buy a bigger house. The child is a space problem before he is a child. The house hunting that follows shows them touring one unsuitable home after another, a place in what the story paints as a crime-ridden neighborhood, a house that reeks of melted hog fat, and a houseboat overrun with cats that, as the joke has it, might as well own the place themselves. The family stumbles toward its life. Nothing about their arrival is planned so much as survived. Now carry that pattern forward to the episode from season 6, the one that gives Maggie her origin outright, and watch it repeat with the weight turned up. In And Maggie Makes Three, which aired in the January of 1995, Homer does not even receive the news of the pregnancy directly. A neighbor congratulates him by accident, and that is how he learns that Marge is carrying their third child. His reaction is not the misreading of the earlier flashback. It is despair. He cries out that all their financial plans are ruined, that they are doomed, he tells us, and the doom is not a small thing in that moment. He had just quit his job at the nuclear plant to take a job at a bowling alley, the job he actually wanted, the one bright, unpractical choice of his working life. The third child ends it. The news forces him to go back and beg Mr. Burns for his old job, to trade the dream for the paycheck, and the child who costs him that is Maggie. So this is the ground the theory stands on. Maggie is the child announced by accident and greeted with the word doomed. She is the pregnancy that ruins the financial plans, that sends Homer crawling back to the plant, that arrives, in the show's own telling, as a catastrophe to be absorbed. She is unplanned, and for a moment she is unwanted, and the show is remarkably honest about that moment before it softens it, and she is also the child who does not speak. Put those two facts beside each other, and the silence stops looking like a gimmick, stops looking like the easy visual joke of a baby with a pacifier who never grows and never talks. It starts to look like the quietest possible symptom. I want to be careful here, because this is interpretation and not fact. The series never draws the line I am drawing. But think about what the two episodes give us when they are laid together. One child's first word can be told as a warm story years after the fact. The other child's first word does not exist to be told, and the family, when pressed, wordlessly substitutes the sister. One child was greeted with despair and a return to a job her father had escaped. The corrective tongue extender, the proverb about the wisdom of silence, the magazine that treats her quiet as a malfunction. All of these are the family reaching for reasons that stay on the surface, that keep the silence a matter of tongues and timing. And underneath them sits a simpler and sadder reading. The baby who arrived as a problem to be solved says nothing. She takes in the sounds around her, the bebop and the shove-it and the belch, and she gives them back as noise. The words the family offers her, mama, daddy, the names of the people who were not, at first, ready for her, are the exact words she will not say. There is a strange comfort in going back to the people who made the show and simply asking them what they meant. For years, the theories accumulate in the dark corners of the internet, each one more elaborate than the last, and the writers mostly let them sit there, neither confirming nor denying, because ambiguity is often better for a mystery than an answer. But every so often, one of them speaks plainly, and when they do, the whole architecture of a fan theory can collapse in a single sentence. That is what this final stretch is about. Not the darkness the audience imagined, but the moments where the men who wrote and voiced these characters told us, directly, which of those imaginings were real and which were only ever ours. Consider the question of who shot Mr. Burns, and the theory that grew up around the finale's closing shot. For a long time, a certain reading circulated that Homer had disguised himself in Krusty's makeup, that the man we glimpse was Homer in a clown's face, a hidden plan to frame Krusty for the shooting. It is the kind of theory that rewards a paranoid rewatch, the kind that makes an ordinary frame feel loaded. And then, in 2020, Bill Oakley, who was co-showrunner for that two-part story, simply posted an internal animation note, 25 years old, from the actual production. The note confirmed that Homer was never meant to appear in Krusty's makeup at all. There was no disguise, no frame, no buried scheme. The theory was not a suppressed truth. It was a misread, and the paper trail from the room where the episode was built said so in plain terms. Notice what that does. It does not make the finale less clever. It relocates the cleverness. The mystery was designed to be solved on its own terms, and the elaborate second layer the fans built was, in the end, their construction, and not the writers. Oakley did not editorialize. He let a 25-year-old piece of paper do the work, and the work it did was quiet and total. Not every clarification is so gentle, though. Sometimes the person speaking is not defending the series, but turning against one of its choices. Harry Shearer, who voices Principal Skinner, has been that voice more than once. When the show revealed that Skinner was secretly a man named Armin Tamzarian, that the principal we had followed for years was an impostor who had taken a dead soldier's identity, Shearer did not treat it as a bold swing. In a 2001 interview, he called the twist, in his words, so wrong and disrespectful to the audience. He objected that the writers had erased 8 years of the character's history in a single episode, thrown away everything the audience had learned to hold about the man. This is worth sitting with, because it is a rare thing, one of the show's own performers naming a story choice as a betrayal of the people watching. He returned to it years later, and he had not softened. In a 2006 follow-up, he said that the writers, in effect, refuse even to talk about the Skinner twist, and his read on that silence was blunt. He said they refuse because, in his words, they realize it was a horrible mistake. Weigh what that carries, coming from inside the building. The most damning verdict on that episode is not a fan essay theorizing hidden cruelty. It is the voice of the character himself, saying the cruelty was real and it was aimed at us, the audience, and the people responsible cannot bring themselves to discuss it. There is no theory to debunk here. The insider simply confirmed the wound. From there, the ground shifts to the question of where these characters actually came from, and how often the true origin is more ordinary and more human than the legend around it. Take Mr. Burns, a figure so precisely evil that the mind reaches for a single real tycoon he must be based on. Matt Groening addressed this directly. In a 2000 interview with TV Guide, he explained that Burns was built by combining two sources, one real and one fictional. The real one was the oil man John D. Rockefeller. The fictional one was Mr. Potter, the villainous banker from the film It's a Wonderful Life. So Burns is a blend, a portrait assembled from a historical baron of industry and a screen villain, rather than a caricature of any one living man. That last point matters because a specific rumor persisted for a long time that Burns was modeled on the Norwegian billionaire Fred Olsen. In 2015, Groening publicly denied it. Neither the design nor the personality came from Olsen, whatever the rumor insisted. And so a piece of fan lore that had been repeated as fact for years met the man who created the character, and he said, plainly, that it was not so. The pattern is the same as the closing shot in the finale. A theory feels authoritative through sheer repetition, and then the author speaks and it dissolves. Some origins, by contrast, are exactly as warm as they appear. Mo Shislak, the bartender, one of the show's most bitter and beaten-down figures, came from a real friendship. The writer George Meyer based Mo on his real-life friend, the comedian Rich Hall. Groening confirmed the connection in public, and Hall's own response is the detail that stays with you. Learning that he was the inspiration, Hall said, was, in his word, an honor. There is something disarming in that. A character whose whole existence is soaked in gloom traces back to a friend, and the friend received the news not as an insult, but as a gift. Ned Flanders offers a similar correction, aimed at a different kind of theory. Because Homer's hatred of Flanders is so intense and so sustained, it is tempting to assume the writers must be hiding something, that Flanders must secretly deserve the loathing, that there is a dark secret waiting under the sweaters and the politeness. Groening dismantled that reading in a 2007 NPR interview. He explained that Flanders was written deliberately as, in his words, a guy who was truly nice, that Homer had no justifiable reason to loathe, but then did. The whole point, the joke itself, is the irrationality of Homer's hostility. There is no hidden stain on Flanders. The comedy lives precisely in the absence of a reason. The theory wants a secret. The writer says the secret is that there is none. And then there is the prediction that has followed the show around more than any other, the 2000 joke in which Bart, glimpsing a bleak future, invokes a President Trump. It has been treated as prophecy, as evidence that the writers saw something the rest of us could not. The man who actually wrote the gag, Dan Greeny, later told The Hollywood Reporter what it was meant to be. He said it was intended as, in his words, a warning to America, something consistent with the vision of America going insane. It was not a forecast, it was a satirical alarm. Al Jean added the practical origin, explaining that the writers simply wanted a funny celebrity who could plausibly be president, and this was at a time when Trump had already publicly floated the idea of running. The joke was drawn from the news of its own moment, not from any window into ours. Gene has said the same thing about the whole reputation, and his framing is the honest one. Across more than 700 episodes, the series has thrown out an enormous number of jokes, and he has compared this, in effect, to throwing enough darts that some are bound to land as bullseyes. The predictions people marvel at are mostly the survivors of that volume, the handful that happened to match a future nobody actually saw coming. It is not foresight. It is arithmetic, dressed up by memory, because we remember the hits and quietly forget the thousands of misses. What holds all of these together is a single lesson about where darkness in the show truly lives. Some of it the writers put there on purpose and will defend. Some of it, like the Skinner twist, they regret so deeply they will not speak of it. And a great deal of it was never theirs at all. It was ours, projected onto a closing frame, onto a Norwegian billionaire, onto a nice man in a Christmas sweater, onto a joke about a president. The interviews do not make the show smaller. They draw a clean line between what was authored and what was imagined, and there is a rare kind of calm in finally being able to see that line at all. If you have followed this all the way to the end, then you have watched Springfield turn slowly from a joke into a mirror. Homer, built to be laughed at, becomes the shape of every man who loves badly and stays anyway. Marge holds a family together by holding herself apart from her own wanting. Bart performs a rebellion he does not fully believe in, and Lisa carries an intelligence that isolates her from the very town she keeps trying to save. Mr. Burns is what money looks like when it forgets it was ever young, and Ned Flanders is the ache of a faith that has to work harder every year to stay kind. Each of them was drawn as a punchline, and each of them, given enough seasons, became a person you could not entirely laugh at anymore. That is the quiet argument underneath all of it. The darkness was never hidden inside these characters as a secret to be uncovered. It was there in plain yellow the whole time, in the smallest gestures, waiting for you to slow down enough to notice. A town that never ages, watching itself repeat, loving and failing and forgiving in the same worn grooves, year after year after year. And so the lights of Springfield stay on. The couch waits. The family gathers in front of a television that has been glowing for as long as anyone can remember. And somewhere in that glow, if you look long enough, you can almost see your own living room looking back. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next.